Picture this. The missiles have stopped, the drones have gone quiet, the war is technically over, and somewhere in Tehran, a man in clerical robes is staring at a bank account that used to hold billions and watching the number fall. This is not a metaphor. This is the story nobody is telling you loudly enough about what is really happening inside Iran right now. Everyone is watching the military front, the blockade, the nuclear negotiations, the IRGC commanders, but the most decisive battle being fought in this conflict is not being fought with missiles or drones. It is being fought on a spreadsheet, in a currency market, in the queue outside a bank, in the underground parking garage of a Tehran shopping mall that was supposed to be a monument to Iranian ambition and became a monument to everything that has gone wrong. The clerical rulers of Iran built their power on two foundations: ideology and money. Ideology gave them divine authority. Money gave them the tools to enforce it. Loyalists rewarded, security forces paid, proxy militias funded, subsidies distributed just generously enough to prevent revolution. That system worked for decades as long as the money kept flowing. The money is no longer flowing. And here at States News today, we are going to take you inside the financial collapse of the Iranian regime. Not the version that shows up in headline inflation numbers, but the full picture. The banks absorbing catastrophic losses, the ruling clerics whose families have been living in London and Dubai, while ordinary Iranians stood in lines for bread. The IRGC soldiers quietly selling intelligence for cash because salaries no longer cover rent. And the question that haunts every analyst studying this situation right now: when the war ends and the reconstruction bill arrives, can a system built on money survive without it? Subscribe to States News right now if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell because what is happening inside Iran's economy is the most underreported and arguably most consequential dimension of this entire war, and you need to understand all of it. Let us start where this story actually begins, not on February 28, 2026, when the first US-Israeli strikes hit. Let us start several years earlier because the war did not break Iran's economy. It broke an economy that was already on its knees. By the time the missiles started falling, Iran had already been running on fumes for years. Sanctions had reduced Iran's oil exports to approximately 1.5 million barrels per day by 2025, less than half of what the country produced before the Trump maximum pressure campaign began in 2018. The rial, Iran's national currency, had been in near continuous freefall. According to Wikipedia's documentation of the Iranian economic crisis, by March 2025, the exchange rate had passed 1 million rials to the US dollar, making the rial at that point the least valuable currency in the world. By December 2025, Time Magazine, Euronews, and Al Monitor were all reporting that Iran was nearing economic collapse, with the rial trading at 1.75 million per dollar, and the finance minister publicly attributing the collapse to the 12-day war against Israel that summer. The IMF's World Economic Outlook, as reported by CNBC in April 2026, estimated that the Iranian economy will shrink by 6.1% in 2026, with inflation running at 68.9% for the year. Iran International reported that as of late 2025 and early 2026, average Iranian incomes had contracted to roughly $200 per month. Annual food inflation had soared to 64% by October 2025, then accelerated to 105% by February 2026, before the current war even began in earnest. The central bank had issued its largest ever currency denomination, the 10 million rial note, in a desperate attempt to keep enough physical cash in circulation. To put that in context, a decade earlier, a 10 million rial note would have been worth approximately $250. Today, it buys you less than $8. And against this backdrop, the NCRI reported on April 29, 2026, that a tray of eggs now sells for approximately 600,000 tomans in Tehran, around 20,000 tomans per egg. A kilogram of packaged sugar, which cost 95,000 tomans in late March, had reached 125,000 tomans just weeks later. Families in Iran's major cities are making choices between selling assets and buying food. And the government's response, as reported by Iran International, was to allow citizens to purchase essentials on credit backed against future subsidies. Tehran is effectively mortgaging tomorrow's welfare payments just to keep shops open today. This is the foundation on which the war's economic pressure is now piling, not a shock absorber of surplus wealth and robust institutions, a foundation that was already cracking before the first bomb fell. Now let us go into the banking sector because this is where the collapse becomes structural and where the choices the clerical elite made are most clearly exposed. Banks are the circulatory system of any economy. When they work, money flows, credit extends, businesses plan, workers get paid. When they fail, every sector of the economy begins to seize up at once, and Iran's banking sector has not been healthy for a long time. The most dramatic illustration of just how deep the rot goes is the story of Bank Ayande. In late 2025, Bank Ayande, one of Iran's major private lenders, was shut down. Its deposits and debts totaling approximately 2.5 quadrillion rials, or roughly $5 billion at prevailing exchange rates, did not vanish. They were transferred to Bank Melli, the country's largest state-owned bank. On the surface, that sounds like a rescue operation. In practice, it was a warning flare fired into the sky. The cause of Ayande's collapse tells you everything about how the Iranian financial system actually operates. The bank had become notorious for what analysts call insider lending, channeling depositor money into politically connected projects that were never going to generate real returns. It poured billions into prestige ventures, including the development of Iran Mall in Tehran, marketed as the largest shopping mall in the world, a monument to ambition built with borrowed money in a sanctioned economy increasingly unable to support consumer spending. To attract those deposits, it offered interest rates above official regulatory limits, a classic Ponzi structure where new money is continuously needed to service old obligations. By the time it collapsed, its liabilities had grown to a scale that made it one of the largest financial failures in Iranian history. What the regime did with the collapse is revealing. Rather than restructure the failed institution, impose losses on creditors and shareholders, and force accountability, which is the standard international approach to bank failures, it simply shifted the liabilities onto the state's largest lender. The losses didn't disappear. Pressure that had been concentrated in one failing institution moved onto Bank Melli, weakening it while creating the illusion of stability. Covering those losses required money creation. The central bank printed to cover the gap. And as Iran International and multiple analysts have documented, that printing exacerbated the inflation already running above 45% at the time. The rial continued its collapse, unemployment climbed, poverty deepened, and it was not just Ayande. Multiple other banks, SEPA, Malat, Day, and Iran Zamin, are under serious strain, each carrying balance sheets bloated with non-performing loans to state enterprises and politically connected borrowers who were never held to account. SEPA is particularly notable because of its structural ties to the IRGC, a bank that is not just a commercial lender, but an operational node in the Revolutionary Guard's financial architecture. If an institution like that falters, as the Council on Foreign Relations noted in its January 2026 assessment of the IRGC, the damage does not stay within the financial sector. It propagates into the security apparatus itself, and that is the vicious cycle at the heart of this story. Weak banks stop lending, businesses lose credit, production slows, supply tightens, prices rise further, jobs disappear, savings lose value, citizens withdraw trust, pull money from accounts, move it into dollars or gold or informal markets. Each individual decision is rational. Each one makes the aggregate worse. The regime created this system deliberately. It chose corrupt insiders over reform. It chose to protect elite wealth over depositor confidence. And now, as CNBC's reporting confirmed, it is watching the consequences unfold with almost no tools left to manage them. And here is where the story moves from painful to extraordinary. Because while ordinary Iranians were standing in lines for subsidized bread and watching their life savings dissolve, a parallel economy was thriving, just not in Iran. In March 2026, a Times of London investigation uncovered what it described as an overseas real estate portfolio linked to the Khamenei family, worth an estimated $138 million, including properties in London's Kensington neighborhood, acquired in 2014 and 2016. As reported by the Los Angeles Today investigation into the phenomenon Iranians call Agazadeh, meaning the privileged children of the elite, the families of IRGC commanders and ruling clerics have built lavish lives in Western cities while publicly denouncing Western influence and imposing strict Islamic codes of conduct on the population they govern. Khasra Arabi, who leads IRGC research at United Against Nuclear Iran, described the system directly. The Islamic regime in Iran is fundamentally corrupt. While regime clerics and IRGC leaders aggressively impose Islamic values on Iranian society and spread anti-American sentiment, globally, their offspring enjoy opulent lifestyles in Western cities funded by illicit gains. The report detailed a three-tiered pipeline for moving money out of Iran. Students and academics with IRGC connections, business figures with unexplained wealth, and regime insiders explicitly granted permission to transfer large sums abroad in exchange for supporting the regime's financial networks. This is the system that spent over $16 billion funding Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and the Assad regime in Syria. While hospitals faced shortages, teachers went unpaid, and infrastructure crumbled. Hezbollah alone received close to $700 million per year. Hamas received approximately $100 million. The Syrian intervention consumed billions in military aid, oil shipments, and credit lines over more than a decade. The Houthis received hundreds of millions to sustain their missile and drone programs. From the regime's perspective, this was not waste. It was strategic investment. Those groups gave Iran power beyond its borders, leverage in negotiations, pressure on rivals, the ability to project strength even while the domestic economy deteriorated. Every dollar sent to Hezbollah was, in the leadership's calculus, a dollar spent maintaining the Islamic Republic's regional weight, and by extension, the regime's domestic legitimacy. If Iran is powerful in the region, the argument went, the clerics are justified in their rule. But that calculus had a fatal flaw. It worked only as long as oil revenues were sufficient to fund both the proxy network and a domestic economy stable enough to keep the population from revolution. Sanctions tightened the oil revenues. The war finished the job. And now, as the U.S. Treasury's own press releases confirm, American authorities have sanctioned Iranian officials, IRGC-linked financial networks, and for the first time, digital asset exchanges linked to Iranian oil money laundering operations. The overseas financial architecture that protected clerical wealth is being dismantled institution by institution. As U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated in a formal Treasury press release, rather than build a prosperous Iran, the regime has chosen to squander what remains of the nation's oil revenues on nuclear weapons development, missiles, and terrorist proxies around the world. The foreign cushion is cracking, and without it, the regime is forced to lean entirely on a hollowed-out domestic economy, whose tools, currency intervention, money printing, budget shuffling, subsidy manipulation, have been visibly exhausted. This would be a remarkable enough story at the domestic economic level. But here is where States News wants to draw your attention to the structural dimension that makes this crisis uniquely dangerous for the Iranian regime and uniquely consequential for what comes after the war. Money has always been the backbone of clerical control. Not ideology alone, not military power alone, money. It buys loyalty from regime insiders, funds security forces that suppress protests, pays the IRGC soldiers who stand between the leadership and the streets, and critically, it cushions public anger through subsidies, food, fuel, and basic goods sold below market price to keep the population from the edge of revolt. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy published an extraordinary analysis drawing on purported minutes from an internal IRGC commanders' meeting with Supreme Leader Khamenei. The document described rank-and-file IRGC soldiers being forced to take multiple jobs to survive their salaries. One commander allegedly complained that soldiers on border duty, facing daily threats from smugglers and armed groups, were being paid so little relative to the cost of living that two generals reported their own soldiers had been caught selling intelligence for cash. Read that again. IRGC soldiers, the shock troops of the regime's domestic repression, selling intelligence for money because their wages do not cover their families' living costs. When the security forces whose loyalty the regime depends on are personally experiencing the same economic desperation as the population they are tasked with controlling, the coherence of the repressive system itself begins to fracture. And it is against this backdrop that the IRGC's evolving role must be understood. As Euronews reported in April 2026, drawing on assessments from the Institute for the Study of War, the IRGC has effectively sidelined civilian leadership. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi cannot make significant decisions without IRGC approval. IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi is reportedly making military and political decisions alongside the new Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. The system is shifting from a cleric-dominated structure to an IRGC-centric power architecture. and the European Union, in February 2026, just days before the US-Israeli strikes began, formally designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization, imposing asset freezes and financial restrictions across all EU member states. This is the regime the war is pressuring, not a unified, ideologically coherent theocracy with deep public legitimacy and full institutional loyalty. A fracturing structure where civilian leaders cannot act without military approval, where security forces are personally experiencing the economic collapse they are supposed to be managing, and where the financial architecture that sustained the entire system is being systematically dismantled from the outside while rotting from the inside. Make sure you are subscribed to States News and have notifications on, because what happens next in this story is going to move fast. The analysis we do here is exactly this. The full picture, every angle, none of the noise. Stay with us. Now, let us talk about the population, because they are not a passive backdrop to this collapse. They are an active force whose patience, already tested beyond any reasonable limit, is approaching a breaking point of its own. The protests that swept all 31 of Iran's provinces beginning in late December 2025, documented by the House of Commons Library and extensively covered by Iran International, did not begin because of the war. They began because the rial was collapsing and food prices had become unmanageable. Shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar shuttered their stores, students took to campuses, workers marched in cities across the country, and for the first time in decades, protesters in the clerical stronghold of Qom, the spiritual center of Iranian Shiism, normally among the most regime-loyal cities in the country, were openly chanting for the downfall of the theocracy. As GIS reports documented in its January 2026 analysis, demonstrators were calling, "Long live the Shah, long live the monarchy, no Lebanon, no Gaza, we shall sacrifice ourselves for Iran." Pro-monarchy slogans dominating protests in the Islamic Republic is not a minor development. It reflects a generational shift in the nature of dissent, from demands for reform within the system to demands for the replacement of the system itself. The Iran International analysis put it plainly. The protests reflected not just economic grievances, but a belief that the future has narrowed. Cheyenne Sami, a former U.S. government official, told Iran International, "They are upset because the value of their currency has gone down the drain." But that currency collapse is not separate from the political system. It is a product of it, and the protesters knew it. The regime's response was what the CFR described as a bloody suppression of mass protests in early 2026. The EU designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization, partially in response to that crackdown. The U.S. Treasury sanctioned Iranian officials specifically responsible for organizing the violence, including Interior Minister Eskandar Momeni Kalagari, whose security forces were documented using live fire on demonstrators. Children were among the dead in Tehran province, according to Treasury's own designation documents. And then the war started, and conditions got worse. More than 120,000 Iranian students are now studying abroad, a number that has doubled in just 4 years. Doctors, engineers, and technology workers are leaving in record numbers. Over 4 million Iranians now live outside the country. Surveys cited in the original transcript show that 6 out of every 10 university graduates dream of leaving. The regime is not just losing money, it is losing its future. The generation that should be starting businesses, running hospitals, and rebuilding the country is building new lives in Europe, Canada, and the Gulf. When the war eventually ends, the reconstruction bill will arrive for a population that has been carrying this weight for years. And the government responsible for delivering reconstruction, or failing to, will be the same government that chose proxy militias over hospitals, printed money to cover insider lending losses, moved family wealth to Kensington while issuing 10 million real notes to keep ATMs stocked, and used live ammunition on protesters who dared to demand bread. So, here's the question that every analyst must eventually face. What actually happens when the money truly runs out? History offers uncomfortable answers. In Romania in December 1989, Nicolae Ceausescu's regime appeared stable from the outside until it suddenly wasn't. The precise moment of collapse came when the army refused to continue firing on civilians in Timișoara and Bucharest. Within days of that refusal, Ceausescu was arrested. Within a week, he was dead. The entire structure collapsed, not because the ideology failed, but because the instruments of enforcement stopped being reliable. In Libya in 2011, Muammar Gaddafi's control unraveled once. The financial and military networks that bought tribal loyalty fractured under NATO pressure and oil field seizures. The proximate cause was external military intervention. The structural cause was that Gaddafi's system had become too dependent on continuous cash flows to maintain the loyalty architecture that replaced genuine popular support. In both cases, the collapse did not come slowly. It came when the enforcement mechanism stopped working. When the security forces looked at the protesters in the streets, looked at the order to fire, and made a different calculation. Iran is not Romania in 1989. It is not Libya in 2011. The IRGC is larger, more internally coherent, and more economically embedded than Ceausescu's Securitate or Gaddafi's tribal networks. The Washington Post's March 2026 reporting on U.S. intelligence assessments concluded that despite withering airstrikes, the regime is consolidating power rather than collapsing, though in a form more dependent on the IRGC and more hardline than before the war. GIS reports analysts correctly noted in January 2026 that several decisive elements for systemic change are still absent. No unifying opposition figure has emerged. No significant military defections have occurred. And the demonstrations involve thousands rather than millions. But the trajectory matters as much as the current state. And the trajectory is unmistakably negative for the regime's financial foundations. The foreign reserve cushion that once provided the government with emergency tools has fallen from over $120 billion a decade ago to somewhere between 20 and 30 billion today, a collapse of more than 80%. Oil revenues that once covered 80% of government spending have been cut to a fraction of that by sanctions and blockade. The money supply expansion of more than 40% in 2021 and subsequent years has fed an inflationary spiral the government cannot reverse without stopping money creation entirely, which would mean stopping the salary payments that keep the IRGC loyal and the subsidies that keep the population from boiling over. This is a system that has run out of politically acceptable options. Every tool it has left makes the underlying problem worse. What the post-war period looks like depends on two variables that are deeply uncertain. First, the terms of any peace agreement and whether sanctions provide meaningful relief to the civilian economy versus the IRGC-controlled sectors. And second, whether the IRGC's grip on decision-making tightens to the point of completely displacing civilian governance, which most analysts, including the Institute for the Study of War, consider the most likely trajectory, or whether the economic pressure eventually creates fissures within the security apparatus itself. What is not uncertain is the baseline. The IMF's projection of 6.1% economic contraction in 2026, inflation at 68.9%, a currency at 1.32 million reals to the dollar and falling, a banking system absorbing concealed losses, a proxy network being defunded in real time as Hezbollah cannot pay salaries, Houthi drone stockpiles dwindle, and Iraqi militias withdraw from operations because funding has dried up, a diaspora of 4 million people who have already voted with their feet, and a domestic population that reached the clerical stronghold of calm and chanted for the end of the theocracy before the war even began. The regime built its power on the clerics' ability to spend, to reward loyalists, fund repression, support allies, and cushion unrest. That spending capacity is now structurally compromised in ways that do not simply reverse when a ceasefire is signed. The blockade can be lifted, but a banking system weakened by decades of insider lending and politically motivated loss transfers does not repair itself in months. A currency that has lost 95% of its value against the dollar does not recover just because oil starts flowing again. Investor confidence destroyed by 40 years of sanctions and arbitrary governance does not return overnight because a deal is struck. And the $16+ billion spent on regional proxies, that money did not build a single hospital. It did not repair a single water treatment facility. It did not fund a single school in the provinces that erupted in protest. It bought influence abroad and bought time at home. And the time it bought is now running out. The clerics, as this war makes unmistakably clear, did not govern Iran. They extracted it. They ran one of the world's most resource-rich nations as a patronage machine for insiders, while its citizens stood in lines for bread, and its best and brightest packed their degrees and their ambitions, and left for places that would not shoot them for asking too many questions. When the war ends, the reckoning begins. Not the reckoning of missiles and drones, the quiet, grinding, structural reckoning of an economy that has nothing left to hide its failures behind. The battlefield may go quiet, but the financial collapse will continue to roar. And that collapse will test whether a regime that has survived everything, sanctions, protests, assassinations, proxy wars, currency crises, and now a US-Israeli air campaign, can survive the one thing it never adequately prepared for: running out of money. We will keep watching every development here at States News, every economic data point, every bank that wobbles, every protest that sparks, every diplomatic signal that suggests the post-war reconstruction is or isn't delivering the relief ordinary Iranians desperately need. If this is the kind of rigorous, no-noise analysis you want, subscribe to States News right now. Hit the notification bell. Leave a comment below and tell us, do you think the Iranian regime can survive the financial reckoning that comes after the war? Or is the economic collapse already too far advanced to reverse, regardless of what happens at the negotiating table? We read every comment. Thank you for watching States News.